World War II was a conflict of unprecedented scale, leaving a profound impact on the world, and nowhere was this more evident than in the harrowing statistics of German military casualties. Over 6 years, millions of German soldiers were deployed across various fronts, engaging in some of the most brutal and unforgiving battles ever recorded. From the frigid wastelands of the Eastern Front to the perilous Atlantic waters, they endured extreme conditions and relentless combat. The numbers we explore are not just figures. They represent the staggering human cost of war, revealing the immense sacrifices made by those on the front lines. As we delve deeper, we uncover a story of endurance, strategy, and the grim reality faced by the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. Total German military casualties in WWII. The staggering number of German military casualties during World War II tells a tale of sacrifice, desperation, and unyielding warfare. According to Rüdiger Overmans, a prominent researcher on the subject, approximately 5.3 million German soldiers lost their lives during the conflict. This figure encompasses those killed in action, captured, or simply disappeared, their fate unknown. It's a chilling reminder of the scale of the war, where each number represents a story, a family, a life cut short. Every bullet fired, every command given, carried the weight of these losses, with the shadow of death looming over the troops day after day. But these numbers weren't spread evenly. Different branches of the German military experienced varied levels of casualties, and the German army bore the brunt of the loss, with about 4.2 million soldiers falling during the war. The Luftwaffe, or Air Force, suffered significantly less but still mourned 433,000 men, while the Kriegsmarine lost 138,000 sailors. The Waffen-SS, often involved in some of the fiercest combat, saw 314,000 of its members perish. Each division had its own set of challenges, from the grueling trench warfare on land to the perilous skies and treacherous seas. Throughout the war, the death toll rose relentlessly, peaking at an alarming rate during the final stages. In January 1945 alone, the death count skyrocketed to around 450,000. This was a period of intense battles and desperate last stands, as the Eastern Front crumbled and German forces found themselves on the retreat. It was a time when survival was a distant hope, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, the story doesn't end here. These numbers are just the beginning of a deeper, more intricate narrative about the harsh realities of World War II. Branch-specific death ratios and losses. While the overall figures paint a grim picture, the death ratios within each branch of the German military reveal even more about the harsh realities of World War II. The German army, or Wehrmacht, had the highest number of fatalities, with 4.2 million soldiers lost. This was partly due to their significant presence on the Eastern Front, where relentless battles like those during Operation Barbarossa and the Battle of Stalingrad pushed soldiers to their limits. Meanwhile, the Waffen-SS, known for its fierce loyalty and combat readiness, had a strikingly high death ratio of 34%. This speaks to the nature of their missions, often placed at the forefront of assaults, leading to heavier losses. The Luftwaffe, despite its reputation for strategic bombing and air dominance in the early years, experienced lower overall losses. About 433,000 of its men were killed, reflecting both the nature of aerial warfare and the shift in air superiority as the Allies gained control. Yet, the Luftwaffe's declining strength in the later years meant that those who took to the skies faced increasingly perilous odds. The Kriegsmarine, particularly its U-boat crews, also endured severe risks. Although the overall Navy losses were lower at 138,000, the submariners faced a staggering 75% casualty rate, highlighting the deadly game of cat and mouse they played beneath the waves. These differences in death ratios and total losses illustrate the varied experiences across branches. Soldiers on the ground might have faced bitter cold, scarce supplies, and close-quarter combat, while U-boat crews spent weeks submerged, battling depth charges and isolation. Each faced their own forms of struggle, all contributing to the vast tapestry of loss that characterized the German military's war effort. But beyond these numbers, what becomes clear is the human cost. Men drawn from different walks of life, each facing unique dangers, yet all bound by the unforgiving reality of war. progression of losses over time. The progression of German military casualties throughout World War II tells a story of escalation and desperation. In the early years, particularly during the swift campaigns across Poland and France, losses were relatively controlled, and the Wehrmacht seemed almost invincible. But everything changed when Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, as Germany launched its massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front became a nightmare of endless combat, harsh winters, and devastating losses, with over 2,500 German soldiers dying daily from 1941 to 1945. It was a relentless grind, where each year seemed to bring more destruction than the last. The intensity of combat peaked dramatically in January 1945, marking the highest point of German military casualties in a single month, with around 450,000 deaths. By then, the Eastern Front was in a state of total collapse, as Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration the previous summer, which decimated German Army Group Center and paved the way for the Red Army's push into German territory. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now fighting a losing battle on two fronts, with Allied forces pressing in from the west and the Soviets closing in from the east. It was a time of chaos, with soldiers often cut off from supplies, desperately trying to hold their positions against overwhelming odds. This sharp increase in casualties towards the war's end reflected not just the military situation but also the grim reality of dwindling hope. Young men were being drafted into service with minimal training, sent to the front lines with little chance of survival. The Luftwaffe struggled to hold the skies, and the Kriegsmarine's U-boats were being hunted down with ruthless efficiency. By 1945, it was clear that the conflict had consumed nearly every aspect of German society, leaving a trail of loss that would take years to fully comprehend. The war had become a race against time, with survival slipping further out of reach for those still holding the line. Average daily deaths on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the deadliest theater of World War II, a brutal battleground where daily survival was a grim struggle. From the onset of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 until the final days of the war in May 1945, over 2,500 German soldiers lost their lives each day on this front alone. These figures highlight the relentless nature of the conflict, where the scale of military operations and the harshness of the conditions combined to create a near-constant state of combat. The vast, unforgiving landscapes of Eastern Europe became synonymous with attrition, where armies clashed in fierce engagements that stretched across thousands of miles. The Battle of Stalingrad stands out as one of the bloodiest examples of this daily carnage. For months, German and Soviet forces fought bitterly for control of the city, with the death toll rising relentlessly. German troops faced not only the Soviet resistance but also the biting cold, hunger, and the ever-present threat of encirclement. The daily death count was staggering, with entire divisions wiped out in the span of weeks. It was a microcosm of the wider Eastern Front, where battles weren't just about tactics but survival against overwhelming odds. Such high daily casualty rates also speak to the sheer scale of the Eastern Front, where logistical challenges, weather extremes, and fierce Soviet resistance wore down the German military machine. The Wehrmacht had been stretched thin, and the cost of maintaining their positions was paid in blood. Each day brought new skirmishes, air raids, and artillery bombardments, ensuring that even moments of calm were tense with the anticipation of violence. The scale of loss on the Eastern Front was a stark reminder of how quickly lives could be lost, making it one of the most harrowing chapters of World War II. Survival chances based on year of conscription. The chances of survival for German soldiers during World War II varied greatly depending on when they were conscripted. Those drafted at the outset of the war in 1939 had a relatively higher likelihood of making it through the conflict, with an average survival span of 4 years. These early recruits were better trained, equipped, and often served in units that benefited from strategic planning and ample resources. However, as the war dragged on, these advantages quickly diminished, and the situation for new recruits became increasingly dire. By 1944 and 1945, the picture was drastically different. Conscription was pulling in younger, less trained, and often under-equipped soldiers to fill the gaps left by the heavy losses on the Eastern Front and other battlefields. Many of these new recruits barely had time to complete basic training before being sent to the front lines. As a result, soldiers drafted in the final years of the war frequently faced survival times measured not in years, but in weeks or even days. The harsh reality was that the later one was conscripted, the slimmer their chances of surviving the chaos and destruction that marked the war's end. This difference in survival rates paints a stark picture of the declining state of the German war effort. Early in the war, soldiers had the benefit of strategic offensives, momentum, and morale. But by the last years, the Wehrmacht was in a defensive struggle, outnumbered and outgunned on multiple fronts. The once organized and efficient war machine had become a desperate effort to hold the line. Those conscripted in 1945, thrown into battles they were ill-prepared for, faced a grim fate, often not even making it back to see another month. Regional differences in survival rates. Survival rates among German soldiers during World War II were not uniform across the nation. They varied significantly depending on the region from which a soldier hailed. Men drafted from the former Eastern territories, such as East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, faced the highest death ratios, with about 32% not returning home. This was largely due to the fact that these regions were on the front lines during the Soviet push westward, leading to intense battles and widespread devastation. Soldiers from these areas were often among the first to face the brunt of Soviet offensives, and many perished defending their homeland in the war's closing months. On the other hand, Austrians, who had been integrated into the German military following the Anschluss in 1938, recorded a lower death ratio of about 18.5%. This difference can be attributed to a combination of factors, including strategic deployment and timing. Austrian soldiers were often assigned to units stationed in areas that saw less intense fighting, especially in the earlier years of the war. Additionally, the Austrian divisions, though still exposed to the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, were sometimes deployed in auxiliary roles that may have lowered their direct exposure to frontline combat, influencing their overall survival rates. These regional discrepancies reflect more than just geographical factors. They hint at the strategic decisions made by the German military command, as well as the shifting dynamics of the war itself. Soldiers from regions closer to the Eastern Front were often called to action earlier and placed in positions where the fighting was most severe, resulting in higher casualties. Meanwhile, those from other areas, particularly in the south and west, might have found themselves in quieter sectors or even occupied territories, where the immediate risks were lower. Yet, as the war wore on and the situation deteriorated, no region was spared from the escalating losses. U-boat losses and the Kriegsmarine's fate. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's naval force during World War II, faced its own unique set of challenges and losses, especially within its infamous U-boat fleet. While the overall death toll for the Navy was lower compared to the other branches, with 138,000 casualties, the survival rates for submariners were alarmingly bleak. More than 75% of U-boat crew members did not survive the war, making it one of the deadliest assignments in the German military. The high casualty rate underscores the extreme dangers faced by those who patrolled the Atlantic, often isolated for weeks at a time, hunted by Allied ships and aircraft. The U-boats were initially a formidable threat, disrupting Allied shipping routes across the Atlantic. However, as the war progressed, advancements in sonar technology, better convoy tactics, and the breaking of German naval codes turned the tide against them. By mid-1943, the so-called happy times for U-boats were over, and they were being systematically hunted down. Submariners operated in claustrophobic, dark, and perilous conditions, with little room for error. Depth charges could come raining down at any moment, and many submarines vanished beneath the waves, never to return. The life of a U-boat crew member was a constant gamble, with each mission potentially being their last. The broader Kriegsmarine also faced difficulties as the war drew to a close. The Navy's surface fleet, once a symbol of German naval power, was largely crippled by the end of the war. Ships were either destroyed, scuttled, or confined to ports, unable to compete with the Allied naval forces that dominated the seas. While battleships like the Bismarck became legends, they were exceptions in a story mostly marked by attrition and loss. The fall of the Kriegsmarine mirrors the fate of the entire German military effort. What began as an aggressive show of strength ultimately ended in retreat and ruin. Operation Barbarossa. The turning point. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, marked a crucial turning point in World War II, as it was the beginning of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This offensive was one of the largest military operations in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery, sweeping across the vast eastern territories. Initially, the Wehrmacht made rapid advances, capturing huge swaths of land and encircling entire Soviet divisions. However, the operation soon encountered unforeseen challenges that would drastically alter the course of the war. The sheer scale of the invasion stretched German supply lines to their limits, and as they pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the advancing forces became bogged down by logistical issues, fierce Soviet resistance, and the harsh Russian winter. By the time the front line reached the outskirts of Moscow, German troops were exhausted, undersupplied, and facing freezing temperatures. It was during this critical period that the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, halting the German advance and forcing them into a defensive position. The failure to capture Moscow signified a strategic blunder from which the German military never fully recovered. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military campaign. It was a clash of ideologies, and its failure marked the beginning of a relentless struggle on the Eastern Front. The vast losses suffered during this operation set the stage for future conflicts, including the devastating battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. The once seemingly invincible German war machine began to falter, facing a relentless Soviet force that grew stronger as the war dragged on. Barbarossa's initial success turned into a prolonged nightmare, trapping German soldiers in a brutal war of attrition that would cost millions of lives and seal the fate of the Third Reich. The Battle of Stalingrad, a deadly stalemate. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 1942 and February 1943, became one of the deadliest and most decisive battles of World War II. For months, German and Soviet forces clashed in the streets, factories, and ruins of the city, with both sides pouring in reinforcements to break the deadlock. Stalingrad was not just a battle for strategic control of a key industrial hub. It was a symbolic confrontation, with Hitler and Stalin both determined to claim victory at all costs. The brutal, close-quarters combat led to staggering losses, with entire divisions wiped out as they fought for every street, every building. The harsh winter added to the misery of the battle. German soldiers, ill-prepared for the freezing conditions, found themselves encircled when Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, in November 1942. The encirclement, known as the Kessel or Cauldron, trapped the German 6th Army inside the city, cutting off their supply lines. Despite desperate attempts to break through and airdrop supplies, the Wehrmacht's situation deteriorated rapidly. Starvation, disease, and relentless Soviet attacks decimated the trapped German forces, leading to one of the largest surrenders in military history when Field Marshal Paulus capitulated in February 1943. Stalingrad's impact on the war was profound. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the turning point on the Eastern Front, as the Red Army gained momentum that would carry it all the way to Berlin. The loss of over 300,000 German soldiers, combined with the psychological blow of a major defeat, crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to mount significant offensives in the east. Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice for the Soviets, while for the Germans, it was a grim reminder of the perils of overreach and the cost of hubris. But the echoes of Stalingrad would not fade, leading directly into the next phase of fierce Eastern Front battles. Operation Bagration, the devastation of Army Group Center. Operation Bagration, launched by the Soviet Union in June 1944, was one of the most successful offensives of World War II and resulted in the near-total destruction of the German Army Group Center. Named after the 18th-century Russian General Pyotr Bagration, the operation was meticulously planned to coincide with the Allied D-Day landings in Normandy, forcing Germany to divide its attention and resources across multiple fronts. The scale of the Soviet assault was massive, involving over 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming air support, all aimed at breaking through the German defenses in Belarus. The offensive was devastatingly effective. Within just a few weeks, the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers, encircling and annihilating entire German divisions. By the end of the operation in August 1944, Army Group Center had lost over 400,000 men, including those killed, wounded, or captured. The sheer speed and ferocity of the Soviet advance took the Germans by surprise, leaving them with no time to regroup or reinforce their battered lines. Towns and cities that had been under German control for years were swiftly recaptured, and the Soviet forces continued their push westward, opening the way for their eventual advance into Eastern Europe. Operation Bagration was a crushing blow that Germany never recovered from. The losses suffered by the Wehrmacht during this offensive were staggering, both in terms of manpower and equipment. The destruction of Army Group Center left a gaping hole in the German defensive line on the Eastern Front, accelerating the Soviet march towards Berlin. It marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, signaling that the war was now a matter of survival rather than victory. Yet, as the Soviet forces moved forward, the remnants of the German military fought desperately, knowing that each retreat brought them closer to inevitable defeat. Peak losses in January 1945. By January 1945, the German military was facing its darkest hour. Casualties reached their peak, with around 450,000 soldiers lost in that single month alone. This marked the highest death toll over any period during the war, as the Wehrmacht was caught in a desperate struggle on all fronts. The Eastern Front had become a relentless meat grinder, with Soviet forces advancing through Poland and preparing to launch their final offensive towards Berlin. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied forces were breaking through the remnants of the German defenses, pushing deeper into the heart of Germany. The situation was dire, and there was little hope of reversing the tide. The rapid escalation in casualties was a reflection of the frantic and chaotic battles being fought across Europe. As Soviet forces pushed westward, the German military was forced to hastily form defensive lines, often comprising undertrained recruits, older soldiers, and remnants of battered divisions. Towns, villages, and strategic points were fiercely contested, but the constant retreat and lack of resources made it nearly impossible for the Wehrmacht to mount an effective defense. Luftwaffe planes were few, and the once mighty Kriegsmarine had little left to challenge Allied naval dominance. It was a grim, all-or-nothing situation where every man was expected to hold his ground, often to the last bullet. The peak losses in January 1945 underscored the scale of the collapse. The German command, now largely reacting rather than strategizing, was struggling to maintain any semblance of control. As the Allies and Soviets closed in from opposite directions, the end of the war seemed inevitable. Yet, despite the heavy losses, pockets of German resistance continued, driven by a mixture of discipline, desperation, and fear of retribution. These final months of intense fighting marked the last, tragic chapter for many who still clung to the belief that survival was possible, even as the world around them fell apart. The role of Rüdiger Overmann's research. The understanding of German military casualties during World War II owes much to the extensive research of historian Rüdiger Overmann's. His work, published in the late 1990s, remains one of the most comprehensive studies on the subject, providing detailed insights into the scale and distribution of losses across the different branches of the German armed forces. Overmann's research estimated that approximately 5.3 million German soldiers died during the war, a figure that includes those killed in combat, those who died in captivity, and those listed as missing in action. This data has been crucial in shaping the historical narrative around the true cost of the conflict for Germany. Overmann's methodology was meticulous, involving the analysis of military records, personal files, and interviews with surviving veterans. He challenged earlier estimates, arguing that the previously accepted figures were too conservative. His findings highlighted not only the overall death toll, but also provided a breakdown by year, military branch, and even region, revealing patterns that had been less understood before. For example, he emphasized the catastrophic losses suffered by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front and the extraordinary danger faced by U-boat crews, where more than 75% perished. This research brought clarity to a subject that had long been clouded by the chaos of war and the propaganda of the era. It allowed historians and the public to grasp the sheer human cost more accurately, showing that behind every statistic was a life, a family, and a community affected. Overmann's work underscores how essential it is to document and study the past, not just to understand the strategic and political dimensions of war, but to honor the memory of those who lived through it. His efforts provided a basis for deeper exploration, leading directly to further analysis of the complex factors influencing survival and loss during the conflict. Survival rates and the harsh realities of war. The survival rates among German soldiers during World War II were a stark reflection of the brutal realities they faced. According to Rüdiger Overmann's research, the chances of making it through the war depended on a range of factors, including the soldier's role, the branch of service, and the year they were conscripted. Those drafted earlier, particularly in 1939 and 1940, had a better chance of surviving because they were part of well-prepared initial offensives. However, as the war dragged on and German forces were increasingly stretched thin, the survival rates plummeted, especially for those conscripted in the later years. By 1944 and 1945, the situation had become dire. New recruits were often undertrained, sent to the front lines with minimal preparation, and deployed in hastily assembled units that had to face relentless Soviet offensives on the Eastern Front or Allied forces pushing in from the West. For many, especially those conscripted in 1945, survival was measured in days or weeks rather than years. The death ratios climbed steeply, reflecting the desperation of the late war period, where inexperienced soldiers were thrown into battles with little chance of success. This grim reality was evident in the high casualty rates during massive operations like Bagration and the Allied advance after D-Day. The contrast between the beginning and end of the war highlighted how quickly the tides of conflict could turn. Early victories, bolstered by well-coordinated military strategies, gave way to a war of attrition where sheer survival became the focus. For those who served, especially in the chaotic final months, the experience was marked by a sense of inevitability, as the once mighty German war machine faltered under the relentless pressure. Survival was no longer about strategy or skill, but about enduring a collapsing front and hoping for a chance to see the war's end. Yet, even in these bleak circumstances, stories of resilience and tenacity emerged, hinting at the complex, deeply human side of a conflict often defined by numbers. Regional impacts on survival and loss. The impact of World War II on German soldiers varied not just by the year of conscription or branch of service, but also by region. Men from the former eastern territories of Germany, regions such as East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, suffered disproportionately high death ratios, with approximately 32% not making it back home. This was partly because these areas became critical battlegrounds as the Red Army advanced westward in the final years of the war. For many of these soldiers, defending their home soil meant facing the full brunt of Soviet offensives, often in desperate, last-ditch battles. On the other end of the spectrum, soldiers from regions further west, including Austria, saw somewhat lower casualty rates, around 18.5%. Several factors contributed to this disparity. Austrian divisions were often assigned to less volatile sectors during the earlier years, and while they were still involved in brutal combat, they did not face the same frequency of catastrophic engagements as those on the Eastern Front. Moreover, the strategic withdrawal of German forces meant that the core territories of the Reich were better defended than the rapidly collapsing front lines in the east, where soldiers were frequently encircled and overwhelmed. These regional differences reveal how the geography of war played a crucial role in shaping the fate of soldiers. Those drafted from eastern regions were not only on the front lines of combat, but also saw their hometowns and families directly affected by the shifting tides of war. The collapse of the Eastern Front meant that soldiers were often fighting on familiar soil, defending towns they had grown up in, which added an extra layer of emotional weight to an already dire situation. These regional disparities offer a glimpse into the broader, more complex human impact of the conflict, highlighting that the war's reach extended far beyond the battlefields, affecting every corner of the German Reich. The enduring legacy of Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa's legacy extends far beyond its initial strategic goals, leaving a profound impact on both German and Soviet forces. Initially conceived as a quick and decisive campaign to knock the Soviet Union out of the war, Barbarossa instead became the opening chapter of a long, drawn-out conflict on the Eastern Front that would bleed the German military dry. When the Wehrmacht launched its invasion in June 1941, it was with a sense of confidence, deploying over 3 million soldiers in what was the largest military invasion in history. Yet, the rapid advance soon met with fierce resistance, logistical challenges, and the harsh realities of the Russian terrain. The German military was not prepared for the brutal winter that followed. Poorly equipped for the freezing temperatures, many soldiers suffered not only from combat injuries but also from frostbite and illness. As the offensive ground to a halt outside Moscow, the Soviet counteroffensive forced the Germans back, shattering the illusion of a swift victory. Barbarossa's failure marked a crucial turning point in the war, demonstrating that the Soviet Union could not only withstand the German onslaught, but also begin pushing back. The subsequent years saw the German forces locked in a battle of attrition they were ill-equipped to win, with Soviet forces growing stronger and more determined. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa was not just one of military failure, but also of immense human suffering. The Eastern Front became synonymous with staggering casualties, as millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in the crossfire. For the Germans, it represented the beginning of a nightmare that would see the decimation of their armies, particularly on the Eastern Front. The psychological and strategic impact of the failed operation reverberated throughout the rest of the war, weakening the Wehrmacht's position and setting the stage for catastrophic defeats in battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk. Barbarossa's legacy was a grim reminder of how overambition and underestimation could lead to disaster on a colossal scale. The collapse of the Wehrmacht in the final months. As World War II drew to a close, the collapse of the Wehrmacht became a stark symbol of the overall downfall of Nazi Germany. By the final months of the war, German forces were stretched to their breaking point, fighting on multiple fronts against overwhelming Allied and Soviet advances. The once disciplined and formidable military machine had turned into a desperate collection of units, struggling to hold back an inevitable defeat. Supplies were dwindling, morale was shattered, and the constant retreat had left the remaining German forces with little hope of a successful defense. The situation was particularly dire on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces had launched a series of devastating offensives, including Operation Bagration, that had effectively gutted the German Army Group Center. By early 1945, the Red Army was pushing into East Prussia, Pomerania, and eventually Berlin itself. The Western Front was no less chaotic, with Allied forces having broken through in France after D-Day, pushing eastward across the Rhine and closing in on the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe, once a fearsome air force, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, struggling to defend the skies, while the Kriegsmarine's remaining assets were largely ineffective against the Allied naval blockade. In January 1945, German military casualties hit a peak, a reflection of the ferocity of the battles being fought and the desperation of the situation. Young boys and old men were conscripted into the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia, to reinforce the dwindling ranks. The final battles, particularly the Battle of Berlin, saw intense urban combat, with German soldiers and civilians alike making a stand amid the ruins. Despite the efforts to delay the inevitable, the end came swiftly in May 1945, when Berlin fell to Soviet forces and the Wehrmacht surrendered unconditionally. The collapse was total, marking not just the end of a war but the fall of an entire regime, leaving behind a nation in ruins and a legacy of loss that would be felt for generations. The story of German military casualties during World War II is one of immense scale, complexity, and profound tragedy. From the ambitious offensives of Operation Barbarossa to the desperate last stands in Berlin, each phase of the conflict added layers to a narrative defined by loss, sacrifice, and the relentless grind of war. The numbers tell only part of the story. Behind every statistic were soldiers drawn from all corners of the German Reich, each facing their own harsh reality on the front lines, in the air, at sea, or beneath the waves in U-boats. As the tide of war shifted, the hope of victory turned into a struggle for survival, with millions paying the ultimate price in battles that spanned continents. Rüdiger Overmann's research has been crucial in understanding the true cost of this conflict, shedding light on the human toll that extended far beyond strategic calculations and military tactics. The Eastern Front, in particular, became a devastating theater of combat, where survival often hinged on little more than luck and the ability to endure brutal conditions. Whether in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad or the treacherous waters patrolled by U-boats, the war's reach was all-encompassing, affecting not just the soldiers who fought but also the families left behind, the towns destroyed, and the societies that would spend years recovering from the devastation. As we reflect on these events, it is clear that the legacy of World War II continues to shape our understanding of conflict, resilience, and the human cost of war. The collapse of the Wehrmacht marked the end of a dark chapter, but it also set the stage for a new world order, one where the memories of those who fought and fell serve as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition and the fragility of peace. Understanding this past is essential, not only to honor those who lived through it, but to ensure that such a scale of devastation is never repeated.